Air Force One lifts off. Donald Trump is heading to Beijing, and the leader of the most powerful military on Earth is walking into that meeting needing something from his Chinese counterpart that he has spent weeks trying and failing to get on his own. A war that was supposed to be over. A ceasefire described just days ago as being on life support. A nuclear standoff still unresolved. And now, according to analysts and former senior U.S. officials, the President of the United States is arriving in China, hat in hand. That phrase, a former senior U.S. government official used it. Not a critic, not a political opponent. Someone who worked inside the system. So what exactly happened? What is Trump actually walking into? And why does the outcome of this Beijing summit matter to people who have never once thought about the Strait of Hormuz? Stay with this, because the answer is more complicated and more consequential than almost any headline has captured. Here's what we know right now, as of today, May 13th, 2026. President Donald Trump is set for a high-stakes summit in Beijing, as the U.S. signals it would welcome a diplomatic role for Beijing in ongoing talks to wind down the war in Iran. Top U.S. officials, including Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Secretary of the Treasury Scott Bessent, both part of the presidential delegation to China, have said China should encourage Iran to reach a settlement. Bessent called for the Chinese to step up. China, which is Iran's largest oil consumer, wields considerable diplomatic leverage over Tehran, experts told ABC News. That dynamic could overshadow talks on sharp bilateral issues between the U.S. and its chief global rival, like artificial intelligence technology, trade, and the security of Taiwan, as Trump prioritizes a settlement in the Middle East conflict. And yet, as Trump left the White House and headed to the plane, he said something that left analysts puzzled. "We have Iran very much under control," Trump told reporters. Minutes later, he said the opposite. If you want fact-based coverage on this story without the noise, subscribe now, because this situation is moving by the hour, and the next 48 hours could determine whether this war restarts. Let's build the picture properly, because this story has layers that most coverage is glossing over. Trump departed Tuesday afternoon for Beijing to meet with China's President Xi Jinping. The high-stakes visit comes after Trump spent weeks trying and failing to persuade China to influence Iran to meet U.S. terms to end the war, or at the very least, reopen the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz. If you don't know that meme, learn it. It's the narrow waterway at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply flows. Right now, it's not fully functioning, and that matters to every economy on the planet. U.S. consumer prices climbed sharply again last month as the 10-week war with Iran delivered higher gasoline prices and more pain for Americans. The cost of oil filters into everything: food, freight, manufacturing, heating. Ordinary people are paying for this conflict at the pump and in the grocery aisle, whether they realize it or not. Now, here's the diplomatic backdrop that makes this summit unlike almost any in recent memory. The war, which has been paused since Trump announced a ceasefire more than a month ago, means Trump is going to need China's help, a former senior U.S. government official told ABC News. He's going to need Chinese help pressuring the Iranians to get to the deal that he envisions, the former official said. And so he's going to be basically going hat in hand into the summit as a result of what we're dealing with here. That assessment is striking. A former senior official, someone with first-hand knowledge of how these summits work, is saying the President of the United States arrives in a position of need, not leverage. And Trump's own words on the way out of the White House illustrated that tension perfectly. Asked if the Chinese should intervene, Trump shrugged the question off, saying, "I don't think we need any help with Iran." But minutes later, asked if Xi could help bring the ceasefire back to life, Trump said he could. I mean, it might be. I don't think we need any help with Iran, to be honest with you. They're defeated militarily, and they'll either do the right thing or we'll finish the job. Within the same press gaggle. Contradiction and contradicting the contradiction. And on the Iranian side, the ceasefire is not holding well. Trump on Monday said the ceasefire was on life support, after Iran rejected the US's latest proposal. But on Tuesday, he predicted Iran would make a deal and give up its enriched uranium. 100%. They're going to stop, Trump told WABC Radio, repeating his claim that Iran had agreed to hand over its enriched uranium supply to the US, but went back on its promise. Iran's position is equally firm. Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson Esmail Baghaei said Tuesday that Tehran would not accept the US imposing its will on Iran. In an interview with India's TV Today, Baghaei said talks needed give and take and criticized the US for pushing maximalist demands. Two sides, both claiming the other has broken its word. A ceasefire described as barely breathing. And the man who brokered it is now flying across the Pacific, hoping a third party can fix what direct talks have not. That is where we are. Here's what nobody is talking about enough. While Trump is asking China to pressure Iran, China quietly told its own companies to defy new U.S. sanctions targeting Iranian financing, openly blocking American enforcement for the first time. Ask yourself, why would a country act that way right before agreeing to help? The surface story here is a diplomatic summit, 2 leaders, a handshake, statements for the cameras. But underneath that surface is something far more consequential, a fundamental shift in how power is being distributed in the world right now. Xi feels the deck has been reshuffled in his favor, largely as a result of the Iran war, China analysts said, citing a drawdown of U.S. assets in the region and what Beijing views as a fracturing network of American alliances worldwide. Think about what that means. A war that was framed as American strength, swift military action, overwhelming force, is being read in Beijing as a strategic opportunity, not a warning. I think one of the big things that China watches is our ability to work closely with other countries, said Dr. Kurt Campbell, who was Deputy Secretary of State under former President Joe Biden. And I think quietly, when we interact with Chinese strategists, they're feeling pretty good right now. They're feeling that the United States is largely operating alone in the Iran conflict, where American allies responded to Trump's call for help clearing the Strait of Hormuz with a resounding silence. Resounding silence from America's own allies. Thailand, a U.S. treaty ally, is one of many Southeast Asian neighbors that viewed Washington as a hedge against an overbearing China. But it's being forced into tough foreign policy reevaluations. Its foreign minister complained last month that the U.S. had done nothing to alleviate the economic impact of its Iran war. We don't want to condemn the U.S. directly, but this is not something that should not have been started, he told the Washington Post. That kind of statement from a treaty ally in public, that is not a small thing. Meanwhile, Washington and Beijing have already traded blows over Iran. The U.S. Treasury Department last week sanctioned currency houses that it said help Iran finance its military in violation of U.S. sanctions. China told companies to defy the new U.S. enforcement, blocking such an action for the first time. So these two powers are simultaneously in conflict over Iran's financing, and Trump is now asking that same power to be a diplomatic partner on Iran's future. What does China actually want from this meeting? What is the price of its cooperation? That question doesn't have a public answer yet, and that's the part that should make any serious geopolitical observer pause. What do you think Beijing will ask for in return? Drop your perspective in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you think the real ask is going to be. The war offers challenges and opportunities for China. While the administration wants it to lean on its nominal allies in Tehran, its displeasure over the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, a significant supply route for its oil imports, could instead trigger pressure on Trump. And any diplomatic help that China does offer is likely to come with strings attached, on trade or even an issue that Beijing regards as existential, its claims of sovereignty over Taiwan. Taiwan. That word keeps surfacing in every expert assessment of this summit. Trump has said he expects Taiwan to come up at the summit. Some experts argue Xi sees the meeting as an opportunity to win public statements on Taiwan from the U.S. that China would see as important for its longer-term political strategy toward the island. A war in the Middle East, possibly reshaping the future of an island in the Pacific. These stories are connected, and that connection is what makes this summit genuinely historic in its stakes. Here's the detail that changes everything else in this story. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth told lawmakers that it would take months and years for the U.S. to replenish some of the munitions depleted in Iran. Retired Colonel Mark Kansian estimated that the military used half of its critical munitions, like Tomahawk missiles. Half of America's critical precision munitions. Gone. The United States has enough munitions to fight this war if it stubs up again, Kansian told ABC News. But the risk is in a future war with China, where inventory levels are far below where war planners would like them to be. And U.S. commanders in Asia have privately expressed concern about the depletion of assets and munitions. So, Trump is walking into a meeting with the one country that American military planners most worry about in a potential future conflict, at the precise moment when U.S. stockpiles are at their most depleted in recent memory. That is not a detail. That is the subtext of this entire summit. Strip away the diplomatic language and the strategic terminology for a moment. Step back from the summits and the sanctions, and ask a different question. Who is actually living inside this? U.S. consumer prices climbed sharply again last month as the 10-week war with Iran delivered higher gasoline prices and more pain for Americans. The bottom line is that higher energy prices are baked in for the foreseeable future. The price of crude oil makes up about half of the cost of a gallon of gas, and U.S. elections are less than 6 months away. Think about what a sustained fuel price increase does to an ordinary family. Not an economic abstraction, an actual household. Someone working 2 jobs to cover rent. A small trucking company watching its operating costs climb every week. A farmer whose diesel bill has doubled. The cost of the Iran war doesn't stay in the Persian Gulf. It spreads. It travels the supply chain until it ends up on a grocery receipt or a utility bill in a city that couldn't find Iran on a map. Trump is pushing for a federal gas tax holiday. Pausing the tax would likely require action by Congress, and if it succeeded, could blow back on Americans in other ways. The U.S. Treasury estimates the government will borrow $2 trillion next year to fund the deficit, while the stock of debt rose this month past a record high. So the political pressure is real. Midterms are approaching, and a gas tax holiday, if it ever passes, would be paid for with borrowed money, loaded onto a national debt already climbing past new highs. Now extend this further. Think about the tanker operators, the shipping companies, the maritime insurers who are running cargo through one of the most contested waterways on Earth right now. The Strait of Hormuz, still not fully cleared, still carrying the residue of mines and military standoffs. The crews aboard those vessels, many of them from countries that have no stake in this conflict, navigating waters that became a battlefield 10 weeks ago. Iran's ambassador to China, in a post on X this week, pressed Tehran's case with Beijing, saying the relationship between the two is too strong for the U.S. to overcome. That's a public diplomatic signal, released on social media, timed to land right before Trump arrives. Tehran is watching this summit, and it's making its own play. Meanwhile, in Taiwan, an island of 23 million people that has watched this war unfold with particular attention, every move at this summit carries a specific anxiety. The question there isn't abstract. It's whether the U.S. commitment to their security is being quietly traded away in exchange for Chinese cooperation on Iran. The so-called balance of deterrence pays special attention to Taiwan, which China considers a separatist island that must be reunified under Beijing's communist government. And now, with American munitions depleted, with allies expressing frustration, with Chinese strategists reportedly feeling confidence in Beijing's relative position, every statement Trump makes or doesn't make about Taiwan and Beijing will be parsed at extraordinary levels of detail. There's also a scene that doesn't make it into most of the geopolitical coverage. Also meeting Trump in Beijing are more than a dozen CEOs of major American corporations: Apple, Boeing, Goldman Sachs, and others, according to the White House. Trump's friend Elon Musk, of Tesla, SpaceX, and the social platform X, is also expected to join. That detail is not cosmetic. When the heads of Apple and Boeing sit in a room with the president during a high-stakes summit with China, a country that manufactures Apple's products and buys Boeing's planes, the conversation about diplomatic pressure on Iran is happening inside a web of commercial entanglements that complicate every clean strategic position. These companies need China. China knows they need China, and they're sitting at the table. The stakes of this summit aren't abstract foreign policy. They are embedded in daily life, in prices, in jobs, in the security architecture that millions of people depend on without ever knowing it exists. The ceasefire with Iran is, by Trump's own words, on life support. If it collapses, if hostilities resume, the US military re-enters a conflict with half its critical precision munitions already spent, allies who have responded with silence, and an adversary in Beijing that analysts say is quietly watching American power stretch thin. Experts were not optimistic the Chinese would help develop a broader mega deal to settle the conflict. Trump has said numerous times that any final resolution would have to involve Iran relinquishing its nuclear program, either by means of a diplomatic agreement or by force. And on the nuclear question, the most consequential piece of this entire puzzle, China is not likely to help. It doesn't seem to me that there's any signal from Beijing that they would be willing to go along with Trump's real ask on Iran, which is no nuclear capability, said Elaine Dezensky of FDD. I think they're fine to go along with the Iranian narrative on that. So if China won't move on the nuclear question, and Iran won't surrender enrichment, and the ceasefire keeps fraying, what actually happens next? That answer is not written yet. Step back and look at the full canvas. We are watching, in real time, a reordering of global power dynamics that has been building for years, but is now accelerating in ways that even seasoned analysts are struggling to fully map. A tumultuous global situation, consciously created by the American president, will make the backdrop for this summit unlike any meeting of US and Chinese leaders since President Richard Nixon coaxed China onto the world stage in the 1970s. That comparison is not made lightly. The Nixon opening was a fundamental reshaping of the global order. What's being said here is that this summit carries that scale of consequence, not because of what will be announced, but because of the underlying strategic conditions surrounding it. Ian Lesser, a distinguished fellow at the German Marshall Fund, said Trump's frantic foreign policy activism in his second term likely surprised the Chinese. Now, that said, this activism doesn't necessarily add up to increased influence. In fact, I think the unresolved nature of some of these interventions, in a sense, raises more questions than it answers. Lesser argued the open-ended Iran situation is a recipe for the United States being seen in Beijing as somehow weaker, at least more distracted than it might otherwise have been. Weaker, more distracted. Those are not terms that appear in official US government statements, but they are the assessments forming in Chinese strategic circles, according to former officials and analysts. Now, set that against the longer arc. The US military's deterrence posture in the Pacific, its ability to project force around Taiwan, to signal credibility to allies in Japan, South Korea, Australia, the Philippines, runs on the very munition stockpiles that are now, per the Pentagon's own figures, significantly depleted. The US maintains a footprint in the Indo-Pacific as part of its efforts to deter China from taking offensive action in its neighborhood. That footprint still exists, but the teeth behind it are being quietly rebuilt, slowly, over months and years, according to the Secretary of Defense himself. What does Xi see when he looks at that picture? An adversary in a position of genuine, if temporary, vulnerability. The question strategists in every major capital are asking right now, does Xi move in that window, or does he bank the advantage for later? There's no clear answer, but the question itself is now live in a way it perhaps wasn't 12 months ago. And then there's the domestic American dimension that ties everything together. The 2026 midterm elections will be a crucial referendum on Trump and the Republican Party as they seek to retain a lock on both chambers of Congress. A war that has raised gas prices, a ceasefire that is struggling to survive, a summit where Trump needs something from an adversary but can't appear to need it. The political and the geopolitical are pulling in opposite directions simultaneously. Craig Singleton of FDD put it plainly, "I think they're just going to keep calling for calm and broader de-escalation, and the reason is, I don't think Beijing is going to stick its neck out to solve a war it didn't start and it doesn't control." If that analysis is correct, and the weight of expert opinion suggests it probably is, then Trump leaves Beijing without the Iranian settlement he came for. The ceasefire either holds in its fragile form or it doesn't. And the deeper structural issues, nuclear capability, Strait of Hormuz, munitions, Taiwan, remain exactly where they were. What happens after that? That is the unresolved question at the center of the story, not just for governments and analysts and intelligence agencies monitoring every signal from Beijing, but for the people filling their tanks, for the crews navigating contested waters, for the 23 million people on an island watching the world's two superpowers negotiate their future in a room they're not allowed into. This summit ends, and then the real work begins. Or doesn't. This story doesn't resolve when the summit ends. If anything, that's when it gets harder to track, because the most significant developments will happen quietly, in the follow-up, in what's said and what's pointedly not said. What do you think China's actual price is for any help it offers? Does this ceasefire hold? And what does a depleted U.S. munitions stockpile mean for Taiwan's security over the next 2 years? Drop your take in the comments. I want to hear where you think this goes. Subscribe if you want to follow every major development as it happens. This story is nowhere near its final chapter.